got 152 yards. Should be just a nice, comfortable 9-iron for him. They're going to go nuts when he hits this thing.
That's dirt.
Yo, yo, yo. Welcome in to my preview for the 2025 Open Championship. Extremely excited for this. Brought a big guest alongside with me to help get us started, help assess some of the favorites on the board this week. Of course, editor of the Sporting Life. You know him, host of the Slice Pod. Welcome back to the program, Ben Coley. Great to have you joining us from over in the UK this evening. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really good. Thanks, Joe. It's good to be here. It's a great time of year to be a British golf fan. I'm just a little sad I'm not there. I was at Portrush in 2019, and it was, from a working perspective, definitely the best week I've had in 15 years doing this. So I'll take half as good a week this time, but I'm sadly not going to be in Portrush with everybody else.
Well, amazing to hear that you've been there and been on the grounds before. Before we get started, and I just wanted to kind of talk through some of the favorites with you and sort of the top contenders. But before we do that, being at Portrush, having a good understanding of the course, what are like the main skill set attributes or trends that you're sort of looking for when assessing players' success probabilities at this course in particular?
Well, I guess a couple of things stood out from 2019. Number one, the two players who really had it between them were probably as comfortable as it gets playing links golf. You know, Shane Lowry, this is the form of golf he grew up playing. He won the Irish Open as an amateur. If all golf was links golf, he would be one of the top 5 players in the world. And obviously, as we speak today, he's not far off that level anyway. And Tommy Fleetwood, born on the northwest coast of England, really not that far from Portrush, you know. I guess you get across there in about an hour on a decent boat. So, that's the number one thing, really. And I think it speaks to the fact that when we come to the Open, although I, and I'm sure yourself and pretty much everybody who does this week to week, will still be checking in on the stats and trying to, you know, find ways to really understand more about what makes these players tick. There's that element too of, well, these stats we're going to rely on, that we're going to talk about, are built on a different form of the game. Something Scottie Scheffler talked about really in the run-up to the Scottish Open. You know, he said he's going to use so many different clubs around the greens. So when we're looking at the season-long around the green stats, right, we've got to bear in mind that that's kind of based on wedges from thick lies most of the time, and this is different. So I think there's that sense of like a natural affinity for the type of golf. And then the other thing, I suppose, that Portrush has got really, really amazing greens. They're probably one of many protections, and I guess if the weather's bad, the weather will remain the number one protection. But after that, the greens are the complicated thing. So it kind of makes me think Augusta in a way, and there are two reasons for that. One is that we know approach play at Augusta has always been the best place to start. I mean, when is it not? But the other thing at Augusta, you need not just to be good around the greens, but you need to be fearless, creative, imaginative, and also sensible and smart. And their skills, I think, really transfer to Portrush. And who knows, maybe it's why when you look at that 2019 leaderboard, every single player in the top 10 has played really well in the Masters.
Yeah, it's a good point, because when I think of Portrush, I think of the greens too. It's just different for me than something you would see at Troon or Liverpool or St. Andrews. They're much more provocative. They're much more tiered. I noticed just a couple of very modest changes to the scorecard and some yardages in your early scouting of the tournament. Is there anything different agronomy wise or length of the rough? I know that the superintendent spoke about hoping to have drier conditions this time around, maybe firm up the golf course, but do you expect it to play any different, or can we use 2019 as a good reference point for how this course is going to play, you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I hope it's a good reference point. My overriding memory, well, one of many memories actually from that week, is how wet I got on the Wednesday when I found myself at the wrong end of the golf course in the wrong clothing. Actually, a member of the media centre had to lend me a spare pair of trousers and all sorts, and we're very different sized men as well. So yeah, that was an experience. So no doubt the weather played a huge part in 2019, you know, and I think really worked in Shane's favour. It's been an extraordinarily hot and dry spring where I am, which is only a couple of 100 miles away. Now, in County Antrim, rain is never that far away, and I know there is some in the forecast. I doubt, though, that it will take sting out of these fairways. I think we should get a drier version of the golf course, and I hope we do. And if we do, because I mean, I don't think it was quite as hard as people expected in 2019. I think Portrush, if you get the perfect storm, if you'll forgive the expression, if we get a bit of rain but not enough to take this thing out of the fairways, if we get wind, it could be really hard. And I'm sure a lot of people will want to see that.
All right, let's talk some of the top contenders. There's no other place to start right now in the world of golf than Scottie Scheffler. I kind of subscribed to this narrative at Oakmont of asking myself the question, like, can this place tick Scottie Scheffler off? Can it frustrate Scottie Scheffler? And if it can, then I think it reduces the probability of him winning. I don't know if I've bounced back and forth on that. I've heard him talk this week at the Scottish about how he really embraces the difficulty and the variance that sometimes links golf can bring. But, you can get weather wave, you can get these bad lives, you can end up on a pot bunker where you have to come out sideways. And there is a little bit more luck involved than I would say, that he has to deal with at Augusta National or the PGA Championship year in and year out. How do you assess his chances this week in relative to other majors or tournaments? Obviously being the favorite on the board right around 4 to 5 to 1. Where are you at with Scottie?
Well, I guess there are two things that immediately spring to mind there. One, you're right about what he said prior to the Scottish, but it's a lot easier to say things like that than it is to embrace links golf in the same way when it's right in your face and when you're on the wrong side of it. And two is that, thinking back to Oakmont, among the many storylines of the week, one was the ongoing debate pretty much from Thursday's first shots to the JJ Spawn's putt was fairness and whether some of the bounces and some of the good shots that did not end up in good places, maybe Tyrrell Hatton's drive to the 17th being the best example, whether it was the right side of whatever line you want to draw there. And I think there's always going to be that risk with Scheffler in the Open. I think it may be that, as he gets older and as he plays in it more, he appreciates it even more because it's clear that he appreciates this form of the game. Yes. But undeniably it adds some random in there that, the less that he can control, the more vulnerable he's going to be to someone who is not as good at golf beating him in the simplest of terms. And there is less he can control there. When the ball hits the ground, he loses control of it. And so often on the PGA Tour, that's not the case. And if you think about Quail Hollow in particular, now you could argue the other way that, Augusta has some of those characteristics. But at Quail Hollow in particular, everything was controllable. And it's not really a surprise in retrospect that he went out and absolutely demolished the field. And the thing is, for me, what it comes back to, you could have bet on him at pretty much the same price at Quail Hollow, where you've got everything in a sort of petri dish of control. Here you've not. And I would say not since the peak days of Tiger Woods would I have been at all tempted to bet 4 to 1 in an Open. And that's not about to change.
Yeah, I think I'm with you there. So let's talk about the next guy on the board. The favorite at this tournament when it was hosted here in 2019 is the second name on the odds board this week, and it's going to finish that way. We're about a week out from the start of the Open, but it was an experience in 2019. You were on site that Rory McIlroy went through. Opening round 79, he had a double, he had a triple on the final 18th hole, and he opened the day with a quad. Nearly actually shot what at the time was the course record on Friday to nearly make the cut before Shane Lowry ultimately broke that scoring mark on the following Saturday. It's been a very strange season for me with Rory. I have a hard time. Everything seems so perfect and everything seems so dramatically chaotic at the same time. And you're kind of bouncing around, and the uncertainty for me is enough to probably put my money elsewhere. But just how do you assess the probability and the success and the chances that you give Rory McIlroy headed back to Ireland in Portrush for his second attempt to try to get this done?
You're right about the way this season's gone. I don't think when we look back on it and we sort of talk about all the individual moments, it's quite discombobulating, and I'm not really surprised that his head's been in a bit of a spin, trying to get to grips with everything. Because really, on so many levels, even though he's had more prolific seasons, even though he's had a 2 major season, which he's not yet had this year, this is probably the best year of his career in terms of the things that he'll look back on when he's retired.
Oh
Winning,
yeah.
winning at Pebble and completing the career Grand Slam, right? I mean, so yeah, I think as well, like his focus on Portrush, I think it's really good that it was a Portrush Open to really drag him out of that crisis of whatever it was he had in the wake of not just Augusta, but what happened at the PGA Championship. I don't have any concerns about the golf course. I'm really no concerns about what happened in 2019. I think Rory has proven time and again that he's a very good learner. That he's learned through failure, really, probably more so than any high-profile golfer we've seen. Maybe Dustin Johnson would be the best comparison. I don't know if he learned in quite the same way as just shrugged it off and tried again, but you get the point with Rory. No real concerns there. I mean, his open record is like, for someone who said he didn't like links golf 15 years ago and who some people still don't think is very good in the wind or very good when it's tough. 7 top 6s, I think, in 15 opens, which is one short of Tiger, who's played in 50% more. So it's a fabulous open record, and more so than Scottie. I would be surprised if Rory didn't play really well. It wouldn't shock me if Scottie finished 40th, whereas I think it actually would with Rory. But I come back, I'm sorry to be dull, but I come back to the same conclusion, which is that if he wins, I'm going to be thrilled, just as I was at Augusta, but I'm not backing him.
You know, it's funny because I went back when I was thinking about Oakmont, and I went back to some of the comments that he made before Oak Hill, and I found it interesting in that, you know, his first 2 rounds of Oak Hill, and Rory is so thoughtful, and I think when you go to these sort of historic venues, it increases that level of thought for him where, you know, he talked about Oak Hill and trying to attempt to play the course like it was intended to be played, right? And then at one point on Saturday, he said, screw that. I'm going to hit driver everywhere. And he sort of made his run. Do you think he attacks Portrush any differently? Do you think he tries to attempt Portrush how it was intended to be played, you know, in the Harry Colt days and, you know, trying to be in fairways? Or do you think he just goes out there and hits driver everywhere and tries to get it right? Do you have a sense on that?
No, I think he'll probably stick to the game plan from 2019 largely. I think ultimately, in terms of like club selections, right, he'll hit an iron off the first tee. Maybe not the same one. He might find an excuse to hit something different. But I think generally speaking, the way he goes about playing Portrush will not change unless the situation demands it. And even then, I think you'd be talking more aggressive targets rather than a fundamental change. I don't think there'll be holes where he's really still thinking, well, I could hit 5-iron or I can just get the driver out. I think he'll have a pretty clear plan and sense of what to do there. There are some holes where it may depend on, you know, prevailing wind and so on and so forth. 17 is probably the best example where we could see people drive that, no doubt about it, but it might be that the situation demands laying back. But he should have a pretty clear plan. I mean, he's played this course a heck of a lot of times. And look, going back to what you said about his Friday round 6 years ago, there was only one lower round all week, you know, and that was Shane's on Saturday, which was just like a collision of all sorts of exterior forces that I'm yet to really understand and get my head around. It's like one of the best rounds of golf I've ever seen. So Rory knows what to do. He also knows what not to do based on how he started 6 years ago. I think he'll play really well. I hope he gets an early tee time. I hope he pars the first, and from there we can kick on.
There you go. One of the other guys, the next guy on the board has kind of figured out the game plan for links golf. One of only 5 players in the field to make the cut in the last 5 Open Championships, and he leads all players in total strokes gained over the last 5 Open Championships. Of course, I'm talking about Jon Rahm. Right now, we're sitting here, you know, on the weekend before the Open. He's right around the 14 to 16 to 1 mark in most markets. Do you think he's got things geared up in terms of being able to attack Portrush? I mean, the driver is still such a weapon for Jon Rahm. Do you have concerns over how Liv is able to prepare him for these major championships, or where's the barometer for you on Rahm?
Yeah, I think you've hit the number one unknown. I'd probably still call it a concern actually. That it's not live itself. It's nothing to do with the 54 holes or the schedule at large. It's where they
It's
are
Rahm.
in the days before, and it's Valderrama. Like that for me. Now it's really hard, Valderrama, and you have to scramble well. So there are some reasons to think that it might actually prepare players a little better. But last year, Rahm was the only one. And he was never in the Open last year. He stayed on really well, but he was never a viable winner, and no live golfer was. And it's too early to know for sure. But the year before, I think Henrik Stenson was the best of the live players, and that year they prepared at Centurion, I believe, versus the Scottish Open. I just can't see how it's advantageous. Now, what the flip side is, Jon Rahm is good enough to overcome that. Obviously, Shane Lowry's not playing this week as well, right? So it's not unique to the live golfers. There are different ways to prepare, but the last 3 years, the Scottish Open's definitely been the number one place. And I suspect really it's an advantage for those guys and a bit of a worry for Rahm. And it's a shame because I think actually him and Tyrrell Hatton, if all things were equal and they'd all played in Scotland this week, I think my first two names on the board would be Jon Rahm and Tyrrell Hatton. So that's something I've got to weigh up and come down on one side or another.
Yeah, so I talked about Rahm sort of having figured out, in a sense, the last 5 years a game plan to at least have a success from a strokes gained perspective at the Open Championship. The one guy who still has yet to figure it out, but is a name we got to mention next, Bryson DeChambeau. Kind of has built himself, curated himself into the modern day American major player, right? US Open, Augusta National, PGA Championships. You can almost feels like pencil him in for being a great course fit. I don't know that that's the same. The only place that he's really ever had success in an Open is St. Andrews, and I don't think that is a really. It's kind of unfortunately become an anomaly in today's game, right? He's able to turn that place into a pitch and putt. He can't do that here. He can't do that places like Troon or Carnoustie or Liverpool or these other venues that they go to. I've tried to sort of reach for straws and see if maybe Liv has exposed him a little bit more to golf in the UK and links golf. And I thought maybe it did, but it really hasn't. He won in Korea, second at Andalusia or at Valderrama last year, which I don't think holds a ton of weight, as you just mentioned. He's been to JBC, Bedminster, at least maybe getting some reps under his belt. Your thoughts on if his style or strategy of play could potentially be successful at a place like Portrush?
I'd be surprised, I think. We have to give him credit. Like Bryson, whatever you think of him, he has been unbelievable at solving problems, really. In the same way that I said Rory's learned from mistakes, Bryson has just gone out and thought, right, that's a problem. How do I fix it? And, his methods for fixing it have varied. There's been working on club technology, there's been bulking up, whatever it's been, the different styles of putting. He's got a pretty unique method that really is effective. And at the moment, it looks like he's found serious improvement in his short game, which is probably I don't want to say it's the last thing he needed to solve, but it's certainly part of the puzzle. I remember him speaking at Quail Hollow, where he obviously played so well under suitable conditions, but he still talked about when it's windy and flighting irons in the wind is really hard for him. He hits it with so much spin, so much height. And it's hard really to think of many examples of players like that who have figured it out in the Open away from St. Andrews. Maybe actually Jason Day and Justin Rose are two of the better examples because they do hit the ball very high, but Bryson's on another stratosphere. And maybe it'll come to him late in life. But I think on what we know today, he's a very unlikely Open champion. I have a hard time believing that he will win a Claret Jug.
Okay, speaking of two things, I think this is a good segue into the next guy I want to talk about, because the current holder of the Claret Jug, also something very interesting I found in what you mentioned about hitting the ball high and apex height and that kind of stuff, and being able to hit this low penetrating ball flight that often is a a key sort of indicator of success at Open Championships. I looked a lot at Xander Schauffele this year, and I really wanted to back him. So I was trying to find reasons to. And in looking at some of the data, I think Xander, behind only Jon Rahm, by the way, in total strokes gained over the last 5 years at the Open. So he understands the task at hand. But he was always ideal for links golf because he hit it low. He hit a draw that would just run out there, play it on the ground, right? To give some context, last season I looked at his average apex driver height, 97 feet, which is just much lower than tour average. This year, I don't know if it's a new club. I don't know if it's a change in strategy, but he's hitting it a lot higher off the tee. He's hitting it 115 feet, almost 20 feet higher on average. Was launching it at 8.5 degrees last year, 10.5 this year on average. Maybe I'm getting too far into the weeds here, but I think playing it through the air has hurt him a little bit on PGA Tour setups, and it's one of the reasons he's had less success off the tee. And I think that's further accentuated at a place like Portrush, where you're on the ocean, you're getting these gusting winds. It's rather exposed on many of the tee boxes where, I think that hitting it high is not an asset that you necessarily want to have. But he's done so great in every appearance at the Open. Was gained 8.2 strokes last year on Sunday at Troon, the round of the day, to kind of win that thing. Even going back to Carnoustie, where he finished T2, he seems to always be in the mix. His worst career finish, I noted, was at Portrush the last time they played in 2019 in the Open. And I remember the story before Portrush came out. The RNA did some driver testing, and he was how they came up with Rory at Quail was like the one name they dropped. Well, Xander was the name that leaked that week. Had to change his driver. It's supposedly they nabbed 20, 30 guys, but the only name that came out was Schauffele. So it was his worst career finish. Any thoughts on kind of some of the points I tacked on there, or to add on to, or how you feeling about Xander Schauffele this week?
Yeah, I think you're right to have a number of sort of concerns or unknowns. It's interesting the data you talk about there, because I suppose that the challenge is, can you flick a switch? Can you play a certain way all year and then come and adapt? And actually, he's been really good at that. And although he's not won the US Open yet, like, his record across a range of US Open courses is phenomenal. And it's largely the same stuff that goes into it, and it's the stuff beyond what we can look at on a page. And just like his attitude and his game plan, I guess, he's had that consistent relationship with his caddy for so long now. He just knows what to do, and I think he'll go back to Portrush with a really clear idea of what to do. And actually, although you're right, he did struggle in the end. I think he was something like 14th through 3 rounds, and the weather was really bad on Sunday. So all of a sudden, if he goes and shoots 68 on Sunday and finishes 6th, it's a different conversation altogether. And given what happened with the driver, maybe we can forgive him that. Defending champions in the Open, we talk about it at Augusta all the time. Happens about once every 10 years on average in the Open. It's not happened for about 17 years now. Padraig Harrington in 2008. So we'll see. It's a very difficult thing to do, because you have to deal with a new golf course and the pressures of defending. But first 36 holes in Scotland, it was the old Xander. So if you're looking for a positive, all of a sudden there has been one. And before that, I would have had no interest whatsoever. But maybe the return to the Linksland has sparked something.
Maybe, yeah. He has looked pretty good over 2 rounds. Hasn't putted it very well at the Scottish, but we'll see. He's certainly found his name in a spot where he can strike. Moving on, so, speaking of guys who handle pressure, let's get to it. Let's talk Tommy Fleetwood. Solo second here in 2019 was -9. Was a good bit back from Shane Lowry, but a classic sort of Tommy Fleetwood pole position finish there. His stats have kind of been on par with historical averages. He's made really strong improvements, I think, in some of the chipping, some of the short game from a strokes gain perspective. 200 plus yard proximity has improved as well for Tommy. Just, T12, 2022 T4. He's just been so good here. But it's that aspect of pressure. Last year at Troon, he had all the narrative circulating him, and it was a bad performance for him. We saw what happened at the Travelers a couple of weeks ago. Round 4 looking at his scoring averages by round throughout his career, has been easily the worst round of his 4 rounds, unfortunately, for Tommy. I know this may be sort of near and dear to your heart, Ben, but is he someone who, at like a 25-1 price, you think you can feel comfortable backing to potentially win a US Open? Like, what are the things working for or maybe against for Tommy?
No, it's a really fair question around his odds and the sort of win potential. When you're talking about players like Ludvig, Viktor Hovland, whoever else is around that area of the market, JT, who's going to be a bigger price than Tommy because of his performance in Scotland and his links record in general. But you get the point. Like, there are guys who've been winning tournaments regularly, and Tommy still hasn't done it. And I really think he ran out of excuses at the Travellers, and I'd be one who's made a lot of excuses for him. I think he's been pretty unlucky to run into Nick Taylor holding a 65-foot par, and a couple of other experiences that I actually remember in Mexico when DJ beat him, and actually at Shinnecock with Brooks. Like, if it was anybody else bar those two in front of him, they probably would fall into his lap and he might win, having set the number. So I think he's had a few things that you can excuse. The Travellers was hard to excuse. Had he won it, I think every man and his dog would want to be backing him at 22, 25. And so you can argue, if you want to be really stubborn, and it is my tendency to be really stubborn, but you can argue that actually not a lot changes for that, and maybe it doesn't change that much in his mind. He has a great game for this. And the one other thing I would say about him is that for me, maybe the most comparable course with Portrush is Birkdale. And Tommy played well there, and he knows Birkdale really well. And I do suspect that of the Open venues, we're back at one of his legitimate favourites here. So I expect him to play well. What more can we say? He's got a big question to answer. No denying that.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk about one of sort of the fresh faces, and there's always been these trends of how much experience is important in understanding links golf and understanding Open championships. There's one guy who bucked it, and it was Collin Morikawa on kind of a strange year where the beautiful weather, no fans, and all that kind of stuff. But let's talk about Ludvig. Breakthrough victory at Torrey this season. It really, to me, at the time, I kind of felt like, and this is almost always an incorrect narrative in golf, but when you feel like the floodgates are like open for a player, they're quick to come back down. We saw it with Rory at the Masters, but it felt like that situation for me with Ludvig. And then he completely lost his iron play, lost strokes on approach in 5 of the next 7 tournaments. He's gotten that back a little bit. 2 pretty good rounds of ball striking now at the Scottish, 4 good weeks in a row before that. He seems to have stopped the bleeding with the iron play, which was really kind of hurt him. But he's only played in 1 Open championship, Ben. And that's a tough trend to overcome. A miscut at Troon, and it wasn't a very good miscut. He shot 75 and 76 in the 2 rounds last year. Is this a player that ultimately probably is well suited for success, but we need to just let this, Japanese Wagyu grade A steak marinate for a little bit and accumulate experience? Or is it someone you think there's some value in going at early?
The problem with Ludvig is at some stage in the future, if he were to win a major at 25-1, I think we'd look back and think, I wish we were on.
I missed the one.
Yeah, because I do think in 2 or 3 years, if he continues along the path he's on, but we're in a rush these days. You're right about the floodgates thing, but I also think there's a sort of common trend to try and write people off as quickly as you can, particularly if they're seen as being the cool new thing that everybody's cottoned onto, and people really want to say, oh, he's overrated or whatever. And however you feel, wherever you land with Ludvig there, my view is that he's on a path to being a superstar, and therefore you kind of want to be on at 25s. I suppose reality, Rory won his first major at 25s, by the way, but a lot has changed since then. Reality is Scottie won his at a lot shorter, so did Jon Rahm. Maybe we just have to wait. And I think with the Open in particular, I've been on him for a couple of majors this year. I will keep backing him at 25-1 for US Opens, I think, and the Masters and the PGA largely as well. I'd be comfortable doing that. I think at the Open, you have to take a pause and just, if he wins, he wins. But the big question mark is his short game. It's a very common thing with the modern pro who comes out of college. I think a lot of them would say my short game is probably my weakness, but with him, I think there's probably quite a bit of improving to do before he becomes natural on the links, and he probably therefore wants a really calm Morikawa-like experience, and I don't think he's going to get that. So no, he's not for me.
Okay. Speaking of a guy who you can pretty much feel pretty good about in any tour type of weather environment, and he's shown it. Winner of the last Open here at Portrush, of course, Shane Lowry, was just such an amazing story. He's actually third in strokes gained at the Open over the last 5 years, despite a missed cut within the bunch there. Sixth at Troon. He's just everything lines up for him. He's such a good player in the conditions, whether you get firm, whether you get wet, whether you get a sloggy afternoon with the wind. And he showed that on that Saturday where he mentioned nothing seemed to be able to go wrong. Here's what I'll say about Shane. I really wanted to like him, but when you look, he's had a pretty bad major season. I think 40th at the Masters, missed cuts at Oakmont and Quail Hollow, where he showed a bit of frustration at times, especially at Oakmont with kind of some of the conditions there. Some of the tee to green stuff that was unbelievable to begin the year, the first 3 months, has gone a little bit sour. It's funny because in 2019, there wasn't much pressure on Shane being the hometown. It was all kind of on the shoulders of Rory. Not that it's any different. It's still going to be on those shoulders of Rory McIlroy, and he'll still, I'm sure, have the crowd behind him. But Lowry's now a top 15 player in the world. He's a defending champion at this venue. He was 55th in the world when he won, I believe. I still love his accuracy and stuff like that at a place like Portrush. What do you make of sort of his odds? Do you feel like they're fair around the 30-1 mark for Shane to potentially repeat here, or is that just too much to ask of a player?
I think we like to have things justified by numbers and stuff like that, but I've just got like a feeling that for him, this will be a really big mental challenge. Like, how do you recreate that magic? And it's kind of like a expanded, bigger version of the how do you shoot a good round after you shot 62? Like, everything went right, and now you got to start again. And that, I think, will be really difficult for him. Now he's 38 years old. He's very experienced. He loves this form of the game. But there are a few other issues for me. One is that he hasn't played competitive links golf. Now, he's been at home in Ireland. He's been playing. I think he played Lahinch. He will have played loads. Of course, he's certainly played Portrush. And back in the day when Padraig Harrington won back-to-back Opens, he was generally playing links golf off the radar. And Tiger used to go over there and play a bit of links golf. You don't have to have played the Scottish Open, but he didn't in 2019. But he had played the Irish on a links golf course. The other two things about that year, although you're right to say he was not on paper as good a player on world rankings and everything else, he'd won a tournament and he played really well in the majors. And this year, he's not won a tournament and he's not played well in the majors. He's half the price as well. So, he's one who's pretty quickly off my list, but it's different. I don't want to bet on him, but I think if you're building fantasy teams and things like that, like, I can understand why he'd be a cornerstone of those, because you don't necessarily need him to win. And what you're buying into there is someone who knows exactly what to do. I suppose the ideal scenario for me to find a bet this week is to find Shane Lowry, but it not be Shane Lowry. So if you can find his statistical, maybe it's Sepp Straka, I don't know, but find someone who's his statistical equivalent, but doesn't have to rekindle the magic, then that would be the best answer.
We're not going to touch on Straka, but I have another one of the favorites who does share a similar skill set in terms of accuracy off the tee, and it's Collin Morikawa to Shane Lowry. I wanted to, I read an interesting piece from Jeff Shackelford, I believe it was written, highlighting how the R&A and the USGA or the PGA have these differing opinions on boundary lines, right? In the US, at Oakmont, at the PGA Championship, it seems like everything defaults to play it as it lies. Like, there was a clubhouse patio that was in play at Oakmont. The putting greens are like, just play it. The R&A kind of has this different stuff where they have these internal OB and these white stakes that are vastly important. I mean, they can devastate a player or a round and literally eject him from a tournament. We saw it with Rory on the first hole. There's this interesting old cattle pasture at Portrush between the 1st and the 18th that is no longer, the course owns the piece of property now, but they still have these internal OB stakes. There's white stakes off the right side of the second hole. There's white stakes off the right side of the fourth hole. If you go long of 5 and over the cliff there, it's white and you have to re-hit from the fairway. I guess it's just something that can absolutely, just devastate around. And I come back to players like Collin Morikawa and Shane Lowry because I'm like, I think about Bryson and Rory, and I'm like, they hit one loose one, and your reteeing from the tee is a lot different than you hit one loose one at Oakmont or one loose one at Quail Hollow. Kind of piggybacking on that with someone like Collin Morikawa, he made the caddy change. It appears he's going to stick with Billy this week for the Open Championship. Statistically having one of the best tee to green years of his career and arguably the most accurate player in the field off the tee. And we've seen these guys get along well and win Open Championships. He did it himself. We've seen, Francesco Molinari, Brian Harman, Shane Lowry. If you rule out St. Andrews, which we talked about, you can kind of take driver everywhere. These guys, these accurate plotters, have won 4 out of the last 5. What do you make of Collin Morikawa's chances and maybe some of the stuff about how this course could play differently in terms of, being aware and cognizant of the stakes on the outside of some of those holes?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And you think about what those stakes determine and what they did for Rory, for instance, and also probably what the absence of stakes where there could reasonably have been stakes did for Jordan Spieth in 2017. And certainly having Billy Foster on his back is, I know it's not got off to a great start in Scotland, but Billy was there at the Open in 2019. He will have a very clear plan.
Who did he caddy for? And was he with Fitz then, or who was he with?
I'm pretty sure he was still in Lee Westwood's bag, but I will need to check. Now I say that, actually, I think Lee Westwood's wife might have been. But I mean, look, Billy will know exactly what he wants Collin to do, and he takes no nonsense. I quite like it as a match in some ways. If Collin is sort of mature about it and willing to, he presumably he knows what he's signing up for. I don't know if their senses of humor will necessarily match. Like Matt Fitzpatrick is a very sort of dry, sarcastic sense of humor. You might say typical Englishman in some respects. And although him and Billy supported very different football teams from the same county, they clearly gelled. It could be really good for Collin, but obviously at the moment it's only another week they're going to be together. I have 2 real issues with Collin. I do think he's a bit of a paint by numbers golfer, and I don't mean that disrespectfully. I think he's the numbers, everything that he can control, a bit like Scottie, really. And the other thing that is sort of tied together with that is I'm never really convinced by him in the wind. He's played well in the wind, of course he has, but I don't think he thrives in it. I think he probably is less willing to take his medicine and accept the bad beats than some. So he's not really on my radar, especially as he played so poorly in Scotland. Now, what you'd have to say is he's played poorly in Scotland and won the Open the next week before. So I wouldn't say it necessarily has to shape what happens at Portrush. But I think there are enough doubts there, yeah.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. 2 more guys to touch on, and then maybe I'll throw in a bonus one at you. But let's get to Viktor Hovland. Miscut last year at the Open Championship, but his first 3 went really well. T12 at St. George's, T4 kind of right there in the final group at St. Andrews, and then a 13th at Liverpool, despite a really bad final round. The approach play is just so good right now for Viktor. I really have no concerns about the injury and the withdrawal from, I think it was the Travelers a few weeks ago, but seems to be in pretty good form. Still not putting it great, but just a recent 3rd at the U.S. Open. He was really, really good actually on approach play at the Travelers before that withdrawal, and just a guy who consistently finds the center of the club face as often as I think anybody with an iron. And I think that is so suitable for conditions and for links golf and for coastal golf. Right around, let me see here, I see some books with like 30-1. He's kind of going to likely be in that range. How do you fancy the chances of someone like Viktor next week?
Yeah, I think you can argue really that Viktor has done enough now to sort of validate anybody wanting to just bet on him in majors and think no more about it and not worry too much. You think of the difference between a place like St. Andrews and Valhalla and Oakmont and Augusta. He's contended pretty much every year of his career now for a major, and not quite in the early stages, but he's becoming such a reliable sort of top grade performer who's, shall we say, I don't know, absence of standout performances week to week outside of the Valspar, it's been a year where he spent a lot of time on the fringes. Obviously, spent a lot of spring completely lost. He was going off 100 to 1. I mean, when he won the Valspar, he was 66, 80 to 1. And now, it's not taking long for him to come down shorter. But 2 years ago, he's a 16 to 1 shot for the Open. And I suppose that reflects the fact that his ceiling hasn't changed, but his floor's probably gone down. You have to accept that if you're backing Viktor. But look, he just keeps turning up. I think returning to what we chatted about at the very start, the one big issue is around the green game. Is always, I don't think he's ever going to be a natural. I don't think he's ever, he's got to find ways to just be okay. And at the moment, it doesn't look like he has. And I think Portrush probably asked too demanding a question of him in that department. But you're getting upside. I'm not arguing with that point. I don't think anyone should be embarrassed about taking 33 to 1 or whatever, or having to justify that. It's just the one big negative, I think, is going to be the thing that stops him winning the Open.
Yeah. One of the guys who does kind of have that around the green game, and one of the guys I've been really drawn to over the last couple of Open Championship, last one on my list here, Tyrrell. I have so much uncertainty and I really don't know what to do here. Only one top 10 in the last 8 years at the Open, and it came at Portrush. 69 on Sunday in really tough conditions, one of the best round of the day. Looking at his majors this year, I think that he's played much better than the results would indicate. He kind of imploded there at Quail Hollow down the stretch, shot 77 on Sunday. Similar situation where there was a time it felt like he could win the U.S. Open, and then he's just out of it on the 17th hole. I just think he really aligns well with links golf. He won Live UK last summer. He's nearly won Valderrama. Obviously won the Alfred Dunhill Links Championship as well. But I've always thought this provides the best opportunity for him to win a majors. Now, here's the thing: is it's like Tyrrell's going to be 34 this year. It seems like with respect to Bryson, the majority of the players who've gone over and joined Live have not gotten better in majors. Is this his time? Like, is now the time, going back to Portrush where he had some success? He's getting older. He's playing less competitive golf on average on the year. Like, is there pressure for him to make it work this time? And do you think it could for someone like Tyrrell?
It's an interesting question about his mindset. He's really hard to weigh up in that regard, because what we see on the outside and what we see when he speaks to the press, and that I probably best encapsulated by that JJ Spawn reaction clip, which I'm sure everyone has seen, where you go absolute fury to genuine warmth for a competitor. I think at his core, he's a nice guy who just struggles to find the right outlet for his frustration, shall we say. But I think there's so much to like about Tyrrell. I think being 34, is around the age, and Shane was 32, was he? Being a little bit older, this is the average age of Open winners is that bit more. It generally takes people time to figure it out. I think even though he won the Dunhill Links back-to-back, I think in the early days of his career, links golf was probably a bit too frustrating. And they set the Dunhill Links up. They put the flags in the middle of the greens. They try and make it as easy as possible for the amateurs. And, you get 2 rounds at the old course. Unless you're playing in a difficult year weather-wise, it's really not the same as playing in an Open. It's so much softer, so much easier. But he's definitely improved when we talk about conditions, whether specifically links conditions, but conditions that would frustrate you and make you feel like things are unfair. That's what happened at Oakmont. It's happened to him at Augusta. And yet he's been there in those tournaments now. And he really hadn't been, bar Shinnecock, which was a bit of a sort of sneaky backdoor one. So where I am with Tyrrell is he's very, very, very high on my shortlist. I just wonder about the Valderrama thing. I think it's the only negative. And so many major winners were a bit unlucky and were very close to winning the last one. And that's exactly what he was at Oakmont.
All right, I've kept you longer, Ben, than I told you I would keep you, but I have one bonus one here. And it was interesting to me because he's a little further down the board, so he's not one of the leading contenders. But, I looked, and I mentioned earlier in the show about there only being 5 guys in the field who have made the cut in the last 5 Opens. So it's Rahm, it's Xander, it's Robert McIntyre, Matt Fitzpatrick, and then the third one, who's actually really close to Rahm and Xander in terms of total strokes gained, and it's Jordan Spieth. Did not play in the Scottish this week. Withdraw from the Travelers with neck spasms. I did watch an interview with him that he did and said that he's kind of on baby watch right now. I think maybe for number 3 for the Spieth family, but he said the neck was no concern. He said it felt better 2 days later. He just couldn't continue the round, and he's full strength. Gained in 12 straight tournaments on the PGA Tour, kind of quietly making a little bit of a run here. His longest run in quite a while on the PGA Tour of consecutive tournaments gaining strokes. 7th at the Memorial. Really awesome Iron Week at Oakmont as well. Is he an option that you think is in consideration and could potentially win himself another Open Championship at Portrush?
Yeah, I do.